I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob.
Yeah.
Today, this is part number what of our accidental Song Dynasty series?
Actually, I was about to denigrate it, but it's actually kind of fun stumbling into a series because it means that what you're reading is interesting enough that you want to keep talking about it. So last time we talked about a Sudongpo poem, and we realized, you know what? If we're going to compare him and Wang Anshi, we should maybe have more to work with than just like one or two poems.
Rob, you said we did Wang Anshi and we did Sudongpo.
Yes.
Really quickly, Sudongpo, I thought his name was Su Shi.
Ah, you bring up a good point, my friend. Almost as if we had rehearsed this in advance. Why does he have two names? If you look at a literary anthology, usually he's listed as Su Shi.
Yeah, Sudongpo is his art name. That's sometimes how the word hao is translated. It's just most literati Chinese folks have several different names that they go by. Dongpo, I think his art name would have been chosen. So that's just Eastern Incline or Eastern Slope, something like that. So, I mean, you can kind of see that he's choosing that name himself. Think of it like his rap name. So it's his Eminem. So Marshall Mathers' How would be Eminem.
Wow.
Right? Did we just
compare Eminem and Sudongpo?
Honestly, I think
it's not a bad comparison, really. I mean, not just with rap, but really any art. I mean, we've got pseudonyms all over the place, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's not that unusual. And
it is interesting, though, and this is my last little finicky nerd point, and then we'll get to the poem, or the poem for the day, which isn't even Sudongpo, the person we're currently talking about, which is funny. Anyway, but he's one of the few poets.
And I'll do what I want.
That's it. It's my. If I want to switch gears and start talking about George Washington, I will. There's no one can stop me except maybe you. But even then, we'll see, because I may be editing this one. In which case, I'll really do whatever I want.
With a mouth like yours, very little can stop you from talking.
Exactly. Anyway, but Sudongpo Su Shi is one of the few poets I can think of who is often listed with two different names. A lot of people, maybe the spelling is a little different because the translator is working with a different form of pinyin, romanized letters, but this is different. Anyway, so Sudongpo, author name, rap name, he's the Eminem or something else.
Everybody just calls Wang Anshi Wang Anshi.
He's just Wang Anshi.
Yeah.
So let's get to Wang Anshi. The poem we're talking about is in the Stephen Owen translation, which is what we worked with last time, called One Day Coming Home, ballad on the death of his wife.
Should we just read the translation?
Yeah, I'll just read it real quick. When we were poor, I rushed here and there to provide us clothing and food. 100 days spent rushing here and there, and I could come home only one. It pains me that we will not live out a lifetime's worth of pleasure. My wish was that when we were old, we could stay together. It is gloomy in the empty room where the coffin curtains hang, the blue lamp flame at midnight, the sound of weeping faint. I can envisage face and voice, but where now are you yourself? And if we meet in the world below, will it be you or not?
Owen translated the title as One Day Coming Home, ballad on the death of his wife. So this is a really powerful poem. It's very simple. There's not too much ornamentation, but it's quite good.
And this is one of the things I mentioned last time. I didn't really go into it very much when we were talking about Sudongpo. Wang Anshi, there's a simplicity to Wang Anshi's poem. You can read this. If I gave this to my undergrads, for example, none of them would have a hard time understanding it. I wouldn't even have to unpack it. I could just say, here's this poem, and they could read it and go, oh.
It's very straightforward.
Very straightforward. And yet, what's beautiful about Wang Anshi is he frequently will just pose a question, make one statement, which is still simple, but at the same time makes you go, wow, that's like when he says, where now are you yourself? And if we meet in the world below, will it be you or not? Doubts about the afterlife are all over literature and every culture, so these are not hard questions to understand, but especially the last one. The first one, where now are you yourself? We've seen that in tons of places. If we meet in the world below, will it be you or not?
So I find that last part very powerful, but also, I mean, this is one of the things I don't like about Wang Anshi, is it's so simple that you just kind of get it and there's nothing else to it. In the last poem that we did by Sudongpo, the last poem in this series, there was a mention of a butterfly, which is clearly an allusion to Zhuangzi, right? Now, here in this last stanza of the Wang Anshi poem, you have another similar thing where he had an opportunity to make a Zhuangzi reference. It's so there. It's just obvious. And the fact that he doesn't bothers me, because what this last stanza is talking about is he's visualizing his wife's face and her voice, and he's not sure if she's really dead or like there's this kind of question of state. And whether or not she was ever real. I think that's kind of what he's alluding to. He's not literally saying, I wonder if she was ever real, but there's this kind of, as she is still in his, has this impression that she's made on his memory, and he's recalling her almost physically, as if she were embodied, but he knows she's gone. There's this question of passing between states.
And it's interesting, though, because you just said you don't, it's simple and you move on, but you just spent the last 2 minutes unpacking what you see in this little quatrain.
I was actually criticizing it. I don't think I was unpacking it.
Well, it's all contained there, what you just said. I mean, your notion about he didn't allude to Zhuangzi, okay, but everything you said after that is all indeed in there. I can envisage face and voice, but where now are you yourself? So is he literally not sure where she is? Can he? Because the coffin's still there. Technically, he could open it up and see, et cetera, et cetera.
There's just a lot more. I think if this were Sudongpo, I think Sudongpo would do a lot more with it.
What I'll say about this poem is it reminds me of some of the better folk and country music songs you'll hear, where at their best, there's nothing particularly elusive, or I've never read a country song lyric sheet or even the best writers in the genre and gone, man, I'm going to have to think about this for a while. But there's something beautiful in the deployment of very simple details. It's something that a lot of early 20th century American poets were striving to do, Ezra Pound notably, who was hoping to create a poetry that was sort of shorn of any kind of obvious high-flown poetic language and just got right to the meat of it.
He pretended to translate Chinese poetry as if it were like more direct or something.
Yeah, it was very strange. And so I will agree with you to the extent that Wang Anshi is not a poet that I'm going to sit and study for hours and hours. There's just not enough there. What is interesting is that for me, compared to Sudongpo, he is more emotionally striking.
He's more direct,
He's
right?
more direct, yeah. And the reason I find that very important, when you're reading through a literary anthology like this, frequently when you read someone like Du Fu or Sudongpo or any sort of the greats of any particular era, you have to have somebody walk you through it. What is he talking about here? Where are we going with this, right? Because just to read Du Fu can still be very interesting and beautiful, but when you know all of his allusions, it's way more impressive. With Wang Anshi, you don't need any of that. It's just there. It's helpful sometimes to know about his background, but you don't really need to know about his background. It's helpful to know about how a quatrain works in Chinese poetry, because that's almost entirely what he worked with were quatrains. But if you don't, it's fine. It's a poem that you could... It's an interesting entry-level work to give to people who've never read any Chinese poetry.
So what you're saying is Wang Anshi is Chinese Song Dynasty poetry with training wheels.
Kind of.
I can agree with that, and that's
yeah.
why I don't like it. I don't ride with training wheels, Rob.
But you surely remember, well, maybe you don't remember, but I still think it's very important because it's a direct entry in a literary canon that's usually very, very indirect.
Rob, you have talked ad nauseum more off the podcast than on the podcast.
Wow, you were actually nauseated.
About Bach.
Oh, yes.
And your love of Bach.
Yeah.
One of the things that makes Bach so fascinating is that he is constantly playing with your expectations. The thing that's pleasant about Bach and some of the other composers is how they play with those expectations. I think my complaint about Wang Anshi is that he just does what's expected of him in terms of poetry. It's kind of it's the poetic equivalent of just lying there.
Here, the thing is, though, expected of him by whom? Contemporaries would have expected Sudongpo, not this, right? I mean, this is
but Sudongpo is playing with expectations. Wang Anshi is just he's just kind of delivering exactly what you were expecting.
Who's we?
I the reader.
I the reader in 2021. He can't deal with those expectations. My point is that
he's not playing. I mean, this is why he's not beloved in the Song Dynasty, right? Poetically.
Well, he was still a major figure. The idea that everyone read him and went, whatever, let's just not read him anymore. Incorrect. But As popular as Su Dongpo? No, absolutely not. As popular as Ouyang Xiu? No, who we'll talk about later. And if in terms of preference, I would prefer to read Su Dongpo. This is not a discussion about how much better Wang Anshi is, but you approach Wang Anshi as like he's a 5-year-old finger painting and Su Dongpo is Shakespeare. The difference is not that great. And in terms of expectations, possibly one of the reasons why he wasn't as popular is because he was playing with expectations, whereas Su Dongpo wasn't. Because if you expect something and you don't get it, you tend to not read it. Whereas if you were expecting extensive allusion to the classics and you get it, you'll probably like that more.
I just don't feel like Wang Anshi plays with those expectations at all.
Now, I'll throw this in too in closing because we can't talk about this forever. Wang Anshi draws heavily on Chan Buddhism, much more heavily than Su Dongpo, which could also be one of the reasons why this poem reads the way it does, or his poetry reads the way it does. And when you talk about expectations, what would have been the expectations of Chan Buddhists reading poetry? I don't know, because I'm not a student of Chan Buddhism or the history of Chan Buddhism, but maybe this. If you were a classical scholar or, say, the average Chinese poetry reader, maybe you would have expected Su Dongpo.
I wanted to take this in a different direction, if that's okay. The very first paragraph talks about being poor, so we have to talk about Wang Anshi's politics. We talked about that in the first episode.
Right.
Wang Anshi is not famous as a poet. He's much more famous as a politician. He implemented the Xinjiang, what's called the New Policies, which essentially they were a Keynesian economic policy of raising tax revenues, taxing people more, and then giving more money, particularly to farmers. In the first stanza, you see this concern for the poor and the life of the poor. I thought that was really interesting in this poem. That was one of my favorite parts.
Yeah, and again, it's like saying, I'm concerned about the poor. You can go, wow, it's a noble sentiment. It's right there on the page. You don't really need to think about it very much. But
there's no elusiveness.
My final thought on this is I really think it's interesting to study him and Su Dongpo alongside each other, because doing so really shows you how different their poetry is.
And it's so different.
It's so different. So, we'll get to Su Dongpo next time and talk about something that, interestingly enough, brings his politics in some ways closer to Wang Anshi's, which is really interesting because they really didn't like each other.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.